Hey there, everyone. This is Gregg Schutze for Ready for the Draft.com, and this is the Ready for the Draft podcast, episode 29 of the 2020 podcast series, getting you ready for the NFL Draft, which is set to begin April 23rd. That's right. The league is going to go ahead and push forward with the draft. No longer going to be in Las Vegas. I know everyone was looking forward to the spectacle of the Bellagio fountains as the backdrop there on the Strip. The new site is yet to be determined. And really, we don't know exactly what the draft is going to look like. I know with the social distancing and practicing the sheltering at home, really not sure what the draft is going to look like. How many days are we going to have? Or is it going to be over the course of just a couple of days, 3 days, 7 days? We've heard some talk about that as well. Really not sure what that's going to look like, but still looking forward to the fact that we are going to have a draft coming up here in under 3 weeks. And frankly, I look at this as an opportunity. I've been prefacing this with the last few podcasts that I've put together that, look, we need these outlets. We need something that can take our mind off of things, really allow us to just, I honestly need this as well. Need my podcast, really immerse myself in all things draft, have that escape and be able to talk about the NFL draft and look forward to the 2020 NFL season. Now, the season may look a lot different. We may not have a stadium of 60, 70,000 people in it, but it sounds like, with the way the league, they're trying to push things forward, trying to move things forward. As long as, we can have a flattening of the curve with COVID-19, that's really the biggest thing. We don't know what that's going to look like and how that's going to really impact the 2020, NFL football season. Right now, everything is on schedule. But you're also talking about, what is that going to look like for training camp? Guys getting ready, getting into game shape, and really being able to play with each other and work with each other. What is that really going to look like? There are a lot of questions that have yet to be answered. And really right now, we're still in the early stages of understanding what this is going to look like. How long will we be sheltering in place? What does the social distancing, what is that going to look like? We really don't know at this point. But I think with the fact that the league is moving forward, this is still something that we can talk about. And really, like I said, this is kind of our escape, be able to talk about this a little bit. So that's why I want to bring these podcasts to you. What we've been doing over the course of the last few podcasts is really taking a look at all 32 teams, going division by division, doing a road show, if you will. Although we're not really hitting the road, but in any event, taking a look at these teams and really taking a look at what did the free agency do? How did free agency change the landscape of the draft and the draft focus, the draft needs for each of these teams? Where were the big needs? What actually got filled? Were there any needs that got filled? And if so, how does that change the mindset of a team? And then what are the big holes that still need to be filled? There are teams that are out there that lost, for every big star or every pivotal starter or rotational player that was gained by one team, you're going to have a hole where those guys left. So you're really, that's part of what we're doing here. We're going to take a look at all of these players, how that fits in with the team needs, who are the players that are the right fit, and really what are the grades for these players in terms of the rounds and where they're coming off the board. So this podcast is going to be dedicated to the NFC South. Now with the NFC South, if you take a look at some of these teams, it looks like we're in rebuild mode. Carolina and Atlanta specifically. We'll get into those two teams. We'll take a look at the rosters. A lot of guys that they've really lost. They've lost. Teams are going to look so much different. Either they've lost in free agency or guys that they've just released and let go. So you're really going to be seeing some different dynamics with each of those teams. Tampa Bay, you've got Tom Brady. You've got the GOAT. What is that going to look like? Tom Brady is going to have an influence on who they're going to be drafting. So you can imagine they're going to want to take good care of him up front and with some weapons. So I have a feeling we're going to be seeing that quite a bit out of Tampa Bay in the draft. And then obviously you have the NFC South champs, New Orleans Saints. What is all of this going to look like for them? Taysom Hill looks like he may be the heir apparent to Drew Brees. They may have finally found the quarterback. So really, what direction are they going to go? Are they going to look for a receiver? Michael Thomas had an exceptional year, one of the more dominant receiving seasons that we've seen in quite some time. He needs a running mate, but has that kind of tempered a little bit with the signing of Emmanuel Sanders? We'll take a look at that as well. So I don't want to really set things up too much more. Let's go ahead and jump right into things. Let's take a look at Carolina. And we're going to go ahead and go in order of their first round selections. So we'll go Carolina, then Tampa Bay, Atlanta, and then we'll finish with the Saints. So starting off with Carolina, and Carolina sitting there at number 7 overall. And obviously 2020 is going to be a huge transition year for Carolina. Ron Rivera out, Matt Rhule in as head coach. Matt Rhule does have some NFL experience, but I think everyone right now really remembers him as the head coach of the Temple Owls and most recently the Baylor Bears. Resurrected both of those programs, and I think that's really what Carolina is looking for at this point, is a young head coach that can really come in and just kind of change the culture. And so you see that with a lot of the moves that have been made. You know, Cam Newton is out. He's no longer there. So what happens? They bring in Teddy Bridgewater, and everyone's looking at it going, well, that's interesting. You know, why Teddy Bridgewater? Well, I'll tell you. Joe Brady, yes, the Joe Brady, the guy who was brought in by Ed Orgeron there at LSU, worked with Joe Burrow, and you saw LSU's offense, the way that it blew up. Joe Brady is now the offensive coordinator there in Carolina. Teddy Bridgewater worked with Joe Brady when the two of them were in New Orleans. So it seems like a perfect fit. You know, you've got a quarterback who actually understands the offense, and be excited to see what he can do with Joe Brady. Greg Olsen, you know, one of those leaders, he's moved on. And then on the defensive side, that's really where the bigger impact, I think, you know, more of the, I think in terms of the numbers, obviously Cam Newton, losing him, that's a huge impact at the quarterback position. I don't want to diminish that loss in any way, but you look at the defense, just the sheer number of guys that they've lost up front, especially. So the Panthers, they did finish second in the league in sacks, but 29 of their 53 sacks, that's over half of their sacks, by the way, were registered by just 4 players. Gerald McCoy, Bruce Irvin, Mario Addison, and Vernon Butler. A couple of defensive tackles, a couple of defensive ends, they're all gone thanks to free agency. So adding an interior presence like Derek Brown is going to make a ton of sense here. But then there's Luke Kuechly. Your middle linebacker was a 7-time Pro Bowler, 5-time first-team All-Pro, named AP Defensive Player of the Year in 2013, averaged 137 tackles a game, while also racking up 18 interceptions, 12.5 sacks, 7 forced fumbles in 8 seasons with the Panthers. His production, his versatility, his range, his leadership, that's going to be difficult to replace. You know, that's really going to be tough. I'm looking at more so if Isaiah Simmons is on the board, the type of athlete this guy is and the versatility and the range, maybe not as much in terms of the leadership, but when you're talking about a guy who can play all over the field, Isaiah Simmons is that guy. And if he's there on the board, Matt Rhule would have a guy in the middle of his defense that really he can build that defense around. Phil Snow, he brought Phil Snow with him from Baylor. He'd really have that presence in the middle of his defense. He can really, you know, he can play linebacker, he can play safety, you can play him up on the line if you wanted to, have him cover in the slot. He can do it all. But he's probably going to be off the board. I've got him going to the Giants. They're at number 4 overall. I think that could absolutely happen. There are some people even predicting that he's going to go to the Lions, number 3. I don't know that that's going to happen, but I think the Panthers sitting there at number 7. At the end of the day, I'm looking at Derek Brown. I'm looking at Derek Brown, 6'5", 325 pounds out of Auburn. When you're looking at the 3-man front currently there in Carolina, you have Stephen Weatherly, who they brought in from Minnesota, shows off a little bit of pass rush ability, but this is a guy who's really not going to be, I think he's more of a situational guy. I don't see him being a starter. K'Wan Short on the other side, Woodrow Hamilton there at the nose. You know, so there's room for improvement there up front for Carolina. And so when I look at Derek Brown, you know, what's not to like about this guy? You know, if you want to talk about his character, you know, this is a guy who led one of the most feared defensive lines in all of college football, but he won the Lot Impact Trophy in 2019, which is given to the defensive player making the biggest impact. When you talk impact, integrity maturity, performance, academics, community, tenacity. So you know you're getting a high character guy and a guy who can be a leader on your defense. Also first team All-American, finalist for the Nagurski and the Outland trophies. That's Auburn's dominant force in the middle of that defense. Now, how does he win? He wins with that exceptional first step quickness off the ball, allows him to shoot some gaps, quick penetration into the backfield. You'll see exceptional hand usage, making quick work of the lineman with a quick slap and rip or an arm over off the ball. And then the brute strength. That's really what you'll see out of him quite often. He's able to convert that speed to power to force his way through the gaps, really just muscling his way to get into the backfield. And then his wide base allows him to really drop his anchor, hold the point of attack, even against double teams and sometimes even triple teams. He'd see that so often in the middle of that defense. And I'll tell you, I remember in 2018, Deshaun Davis was running around like a madman, making plays all over the place, the middle linebacker. And I was looking at it going, man, this guy is making plays everywhere. It was because of a guy like Derek Brown in the middle was taking up so much space. The guys behind him, behind Derek Brown there in Carolina, will love playing behind a guy like him because he's going to take up a lot of blockers, take up a lot of space, and allow them to roam free on the back end of that defense. So, I think you see the power in his hands. Very evident, allows him to really strike with just violent hands, and the explosion in those hands when he really gets that pop gets those offensive linemen off balance. Once he's got you moving backwards, then it's all over. He's going to generate that movement, that leg drive, and is going to shoot into the backfield. And then rushing the quarterback, you're going to see the short area quickness, the lateral agility to plant, change directions, and get after the quarterback. Really rare type of lateral agility for a guy his size, 6'5", 325, but he moves so much better than that. And then just how relentless he is, pursuing the ball carrier, knowing to track the ball from one hash to the opposite sideline. He's going to pursue the ball 10 yards down the field as well. And look, this guy's extremely active, 170 tackles in his career, finished with 33 tackles for loss, 12 and a half sacks, also has a nose for the ball, knocking down 8 passes, forcing 5 fumbles in his career. The biggest issue with Derek Brown is going to be that inconsistent pad level. That's going to allow blockers to really kind of slow up his rush because, look, he's not able to fire off the ball and really generate a lot of that power and that explosiveness coming off the ball. Also gets overextended at times, affecting his balance. But, I think those are things that can be easily corrected if he can stay low on a consistent basis and not give them a bigger target to work with. Man, he's going to be one of those dominant forces on the inside. And I think Matt Rhule, would really have a guy that he can build his defense around, really behind him, I should say. So if Carolina is looking at Derek Brown and really addressing up front, then you have to look at the back end of the defense as well. And, really the big reason Dante Jackson is back on one side. When you lose James Bradbury, he's off to the Giants. Ross Cockrell is also a free agent. So you're losing some of your corners there. And I think they have to look at a cornerback at some point. Jeffrey Okudah, could he come off the board here? If he doesn't go to Detroit, then I think there's a chance that he could be on the board. And yes, Carolina could be on the market for a cornerback. I still think defensive tackle and linebacker make the most sense. So if you're looking at a second round selection, a guy that just, I don't know, for some reason he just seems to fit what Matt Rhule is going to want to do and just fits Carolina in general. How about Damon Arnette out of Ohio State? Now, Damon Arnette was a guy that a lot of people were talking about possibly coming out and entering the draft because a big reason why was because you had, Kendall Sheffield, who ultimately decided he was going to come out and enter the draft. And I thought that it really, really helped Damon Arnett's draft stock. If you ever watched the game against Michigan State, Damon Arnette locked up Cody White, and that poor guy, poor receiver, poor Cody, was not able to get any separation at all. This was a guy just blanket coverage, very physical, very aggressive. He's 6 foot, 195 pounds, and he can get himself into trouble sometimes because of that aggressiveness. I thought he did a better job, trusting his eyes and not getting as handsy. But look, 22 breakups in his career, 5 interceptions. So when you're talking about 27 passes defended, this is a guy who knows how to make plays on the football. And I think he's a guy that I think could come in and start right away opposite Dante Jackson. So that feels like the perfect fit right there at number 38 overall. Damon Arnett going to Carolina in round number 2. Moving on to round number 3. Now, there are a few different directions that you could go with Carolina here, and I was actually looking up front because if you have Teddy Bridgewater, Teddy obviously has those injuries that the major injury that he was coming off of. Now he's 100%, but it was a gruesome injury. It took him a little while to get back. And so you're looking at the interior of that line. Matt Paradis he's got the center locked down. Right now, looking at the guard position, is it going to be John Miller and Dennis Daly potentially? I think, Miller's probably got the left guard position locked down, but the absence of Trey Turner, who was traded to the Chargers for Russell Okung, yes, you get the upgrade at left tackle, but now you've created a hole there at right guard. So I'm looking at Damian Lewis out of LSU. And Damian Lewis, what I really like about this guy, he's 6'2", 327 pounds, and he's a guy who's going to maul you. He's a mauler. He's big. He's physical. He's a guy who has some short area quickness as well, so he can climb out to the second level. And the thing with him is he's not just going to block you. He's not just going to get in the way. He's going to look to bury you. And, those are the guys that I enjoy watching because he's going to generate a ton of movement. He's going to sustain his block, and then he's going to look to plant you and drive you into the ground. And so Damian Lewis, he just makes a ton of sense in Carolina. I think that big physical mentality is going to be nice. Carolina sitting there at number 69 overall. I think that'd be a nice selection there. So moving on to, I guess we can consider it day 3. At least in the traditional sense, day 3, Carolina sitting there in round number 4. They got a pick. And this is kind of, there are a few other players out there that maybe could have come off the board instead. Potentially Willie Gay of Mississippi State or, Troy Dye. I still have him on the board. And, so there's some other backers that could have come off the board here, but I'm looking at a guy like Sean Bradley out of Temple, 6'1", 235, inside linebacker. And look, he has the Temple ties. And this is a guy that, I think he's very athletic. He can make plays all over the field. He's a guy that can drop into coverage. He can rush the passer a little bit. And I think that versatility, I think what Matt Rhule is going to be wanting to look for are guys that are versatile, that can do a little bit of everything. So, 255 tackles, most of which were really in 3 seasons there at Temple, 22 tackles for loss, had 3 interceptions, 5 pass breakups, 3 forced fumbles in his career. And then he shows up at the combine and has a pretty nice little performance there as well. Ran a 4.5 140. And at 6'1", 235, one of the faster linebackers in the draft class there at the combine, only 4 guys ran a faster 40 time than he did. So I'm looking at Sean Bradley. Makes a ton of sense to me. The familiarity is absolutely going to be there with Matt Rhule, but I think this is a guy who can come in. They're at the inside linebacker position. You've got Shaq Thompson. Tahir Whitehead is in there. He was brought in from the Raiders, but there's really no depth behind them. And, I'm looking at Carolina right now and going to spottrack.com to really take a look at, if you haven't been there, it's an awesome website. It'll tell you exactly what you have with, all the different, salary cap and really what you're dealing with there. Takes a really good look and breaks everything down. Whitehead was just brought in on a 1-year deal. So they have that veteran guy. He really was an outside linebacker with the Raiders, but he may move inside. Really Shaq Thompson is probably going to end up moving inside as well, but he's a guy that's traditionally played on the outside. So you get somebody who's a traditional inside linebacker like Sean Bradley, has some versatility, can also play outside, and can cover tight ends. I think that's one of the things too that you really want to see with the linebackers in this ever-changing NFL game. He fits that new linebacker mold. So I mentioned that we're going to go ahead and take a look at the rest of the draft. I just realized that I hadn't mentioned that just yet. But I've been working with my mock drafts and really been focused on the 5th, 6th, and 7th rounds over the last few days. And I've put all of that together. And I know in the previous podcast, we just focused on the first 4 rounds, but I really want to go ahead and tackle the rest of the draft if I can. I'm going to go ahead and put the rest of my mock draft onto the website here in the next day or so and really make sure that all 7 rounds are on the website. But if we take a look at Carolina, going into round number 5, I think they need to find an outside linebacker as well. We talked inside backer. Now we're looking outside linebacker. And I mentioned, Brian Burns on the outside. He's going to be a guy that's going to rush the passer there as a 3-4 outside linebacker. I think that makes a lot of sense. Marquise Haynes, he was an Ole Miss guy that was just wreaking havoc coming off the edge there for the Rebels. And I'm looking at that. I think they need some more explosiveness, and I'm looking at a guy like DJ Wonnum out of South Carolina, and with Wonnum, one of the things that I was looking for was, a guy, he has some size to him. He can play defensive end a little bit, played some linebacker, some of that versatility. I like some of that, but this is a guy who is versatile. He can play both the run and the pass, 29.5 tackles for loss, 14 sacks in his career, the 13 tackles for loss and 6 sacks as a sophomore defensive end. Then he moves up to linebacker and really was playing more of that outside linebacker position, 9.5 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks. Really a guy that I really like that versatility. And then, at the combine, showed off some athleticism as well. That was one of the things that I thought was a little surprising because I wasn't expecting a guy like him. He ran a 4.73 40, 34.5-inch vertical leap as well. Ran a 7.25 3-cone drill. So among the ends, that was one of the faster times. In fact, I just scrolled through there and glanced at some of the times. That was actually the 3rd fastest time among the entire defensive line class at the combine. So I look at DJ and he'd be a guy, his power to go along with Brian Burns' speed. I think that'd be a nice match there for Carolina. And I think getting him in round 5, I think that's good value as well. So moving on to round number 6 for the Carolina Panthers. And I mentioned the cornerback position, and I think this could be an area where Carolina is going to double up. And so they have Dante Jackson. They have Corn Elder right now at corner. They've got Cole Luke, Dominique Hatfield. So really no one that's really striking fear into opposing defenses. But the other thing that I'm looking at there is there isn't a lot of size. And so sitting in the 6th round, how about a guy like Lamar Jackson? You're talking about a corner that has some pretty good size to him. That's going to be Lamar Jackson. He's 6'2", 208. He did run a 4.58 40 at the combine, 36.5-inch vertical leap, over 32-inch arms as well. So he has the length, and I think he offers some pretty decent ball skills as well on the outside. I think Carolina right now, looking at that secondary, they've got to make sure, especially in the division when you're dealing with, Tom Brady twice, Drew Brees twice, Matt Ryan twice. I mean, you're dealing with 2 Hall of Famers and a pretty darn good quarterback. That's really going to be a tall task. So I look at Lamar. He's had really the most production in terms of the ball skills. In the last 2 seasons, have 5 interceptions, 19 pass breakups in those 2 seasons. Has 22 overall for his career, 3 forced fumbles to his credit as well. This is a guy who, again, the length, he's not the fastest guy. I think that's one of the things that you worry about is some of the long speed, and you worry about some of the stiffness in his hips. When you get some of those bigger cornerbacks being able to really sink their hips and really able to transition with that wide receiver. And, if you're slow in your transitions, then that could really, allow the receiver to create some separation. That's why I think Lamar Jackson sinks a little bit in this draft. And if he does sit there in the 6th round, a lot of people think he'll be off the board by early day 3, sitting there in the 4th round. But I just think that there's a good chance that he may fall because of some of that stiffness. 6th round would be an excellent value, nabbing him there. And then finally, let's look at some of the pass rush. And we mentioned, I mentioned that, Brian Burns is sitting there, and, and Marquise Haynes, but there really isn't a whole lot of help behind them. And so I want to find some of that additional help. And how about a guy 7th round out of James Madison, Rondell Carter. If you haven't seen this guy, big personality, a guy who I think, is going to fit in very well. 6'3", 269, defensive end, played defensive end there for the Dukes, but a guy who I think can really be an outside linebacker and really rush the quarterback coming off the edge. This is a guy who transferred from Rutgers, came to James Madison, and all he did in his time there, 48 tackles for loss and 23.5 sacks, including 12 this past season, had 27 tackles for loss in 2019, 66 tackles as well. So very active coming off the edge, has a pretty nice burst. And he's one of those guys that could very well come off the board before round number 7. But if he's sitting there when Carolina is drafting, and let's see, Carolina will have the, if I can find it right. Let's see, that's number 222. So I'm looking at that pick. I think at 222, that's going to make a lot of sense for me. If Rondell Carter is sitting there, get another pass rusher, get an edge rusher coming off the edge, and a guy who can be incredibly productive for you. He could end up being a steal. And again, that productivity, even though it was at the FCS level, James Madison is one of the top programs there. I could very well see this guy getting drafted in round number 5. So if he is on the board at round number 7, that'd be a steal for Carolina, in my opinion. So that's the Carolina Panthers. I think, with this draft, if it's the way that it shakes out, I'm looking at it and I don't see a ton of emphasis on, if I were to do my own critique of myself, not a ton of focus on the offensive side of the football. And I think, you lost a lot defensively, obviously. Bringing in Robbie Anderson really helped there at the receiver position. DJ Moore, Curtis Samuel, you brought in Russell Okung at a left tackle position that was in need of some help. I think you could go tight end at some point. I think you could also go running back as well. Christian McCaffrey's going to need somebody that's going to take some of that pressure off of him. Right now they have Mike Davis and Jordan Scarlett. You can easily bring in another running back to add to that mix. So is that draft for Carolina perfect? No. And I think, doubling up on some of those positions, I really think that depth defensively, especially in that division with all that firepower, I think that's really the focus that they need to go with. And, I think they have some of the tools there for Joe Brady style offense. I mean, imagine Christian McCaffrey catching the football out of the backfield in that type of offense. It's going to be fun to watch if nothing else. So we're going to go ahead and move on from Carolina to Tampa Bay, and Tom Brady, TB12, going to be taking his talents to Tampa, and he's got some tools to work with there. There's no doubt about that. He's got 2,000-yard receivers and Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. He's got a couple of nice tight ends and O.J. Howard and Cameron Brate. At the running back position, you got Ronald Jones the second, and you've got an offensive line that, frankly, needs an overhaul. It's in desperate need of an upgrade. And that's where I think they're going to spend the majority of their focus, is on that offensive line. I think that's something that Tom Brady's going to look at and say, let's go get one of those tackles with that first pick at number 14 overall. And I'm looking at this, and it makes sense. Jameis Winston, a season ago, only quarterback to eclipse the 5,000 yard mark, finished second in passing touchdowns with 33, but also 30 interceptions. And those interceptions weren't all just his fault. Yes, there were some terrible throws down the field, but when you've got, you know, it's one of those things that's kind of staggering. Tampa Bay gave up 47 sacks a year ago. So you're looking at Tom Brady. This is a guy who in 2019, his QBR was 54, which is the lowest full season rating of his career. So he needs to stay upright in order to have some success, and you got to take care of him. So you look at the left tackle position. Donovan Smith is back, was a disappointment, and there's really nobody on the roster to push him. Also need an upgrade at right tackle. DeMar Dotson is gone. They brought in Joe Haeg, and they're saying that he may be the right tackle. I think Joe Haeg could get kicked inside, and there's a reason for that. And I'm looking at these 4 tackles. I think you have 4 tackles that are elite in terms of draft prospects, and then there's a significant drop-off after that. And the tackles that I'm talking about are Jedrick Wills out of Alabama, Mekhi Becton out of Louisville, Tristan Wirfs out of Iowa, and Andrew Thomas out of Georgia. And there's a good chance that Andrew Thomas, I have him rated as my number 4 offensive tackle. He may be the only offensive tackle left. But with the way that my mock draft is shaking out, I'm looking at Tristan Wirfs, the big 6'5", 320-pounder out of Iowa, the junior. And I think what makes sense here is you have Joe Haeg, who can play both tackle and guard. And the same goes for Tristan Wirfs. He can kick inside to guard if you need to. He played right tackle and also filled in for Alaric Jackson at left tackle when Jackson went down to injury there in 2019, and more than held his own. He struggled at times with some speed rushers, but all in all, he was definitely someone who could hang in there. And when you look at Wirfs, he absolutely set the world on fire. I shouldn't say the world, but set the stage on fire there at the combine. This was a guy ran a 4.85 40. 36.5-inch vertical leap, which was a record for offensive linemen there at the combine. Just absolutely insane numbers. Let's see, his 10-foot 1-inch broad jump was also a combine record for offensive linemen as well. And then, not to be outdone there with the records, he also broke Brandon Sheriff's team record 450-pound hang clean. If you haven't seen that on YouTube, you got to check it out. He did it easily for 3 reps. Now, Brandon Sheriff, very athletic tackle, and he got kicked inside to guard, Pro Bowler a season ago. So there's a good chance that if they want to keep Haeg at right tackle, Tristan Wirfs could kick inside to guard, and the athleticism and the power, we could be talking about the second coming of Brandon Sheriff on the inside. Now Wirf, I think the real incredible thing about him, and look, there's a chance that Tristan Wirfs could best Brandon Sheriff's draft position. Brandon Sheriff taking number 5 overall. I think there's a chance that Tristan Wirfs can end up going number 4 overall to the Giants, especially with the Giants trying to figure out, the whole Mike Remmers situation. Mike Remmers obviously going to Kansas City. They need to figure out what they're going to do at right tackle. So there's a chance Tristan Wirfs could go there. There's a chance Jedrick Wills goes there. I still think it's going to be Isaiah Simmons because you draft best player available, at this point, and you can still get a good tackle in round number 2. Isaiah Wilson out of Georgia, the big mammoth right tackle. I think the Giants can get their hands on him in round number 2. But anyway, let's get back to talking about Tristan Wirfs. I think the athleticism is one of those things that says, hey, this guy can absolutely play tackle. And when you talk about it, only 16 of the 46 wide receivers at the combine jump higher than Wirfs in the vertical, that 36.5-inch vertical leap. I mean, it's just staggering there. He fires out of his stance quickly, plays with excellent leverage, shows easy flexibility sitting down and bending at the knees. Good depth, really good angles on his kick slide, really allowing him to beat his man to the edge. Lateral quickness to mirror the blitzing linebacker looping around. Changes directions in those mirrors, really picks up the secondary moves very well. The agility to block down on the defensive end, and then picking up that blitzing linebacker, looping around as well. Athleticism on display in the running game, leading the way. If you tuned in and watched the Holiday Bowl against USC, you saw him as a lead blocker on several occasions. Was repeatedly out in front of the ball carrier, delivering some lead blocks, some punishing lead blocks, by the way, just burying defensive backs on the edge to spring a big gain. And for light as he is on his feet, does play with tremendous power, generates a ton of movement at the point of attack. You'll see him extend his arms, deliver a good punch to the chest plate of the defensive lineman, then keep his legs moving to clear his man out. Especially evident in that Minnesota game. Got under Winston Deladivadier's pad level, drove him all the way outside to the numbers. I mean, just, once he locked onto him, he wasn't letting go and sustained that block to the whistle. He'll absorb contact at the point, anchoring, active hands to keep his man in front. Now, with Wirfs, he does struggle at times with speed rushers, can get too far over his feet, which will affect his balance, allows the edge rusher to slip the blocks at times. Also has an issue with oversetting as a pass blocker and in the running game. You'll see a bit more consistency from him, or you'd like to see more consistency. I'm trying to read my notes here. Not always as dominant as his measurables would lead you to believe. So when you watch him and you watch the numbers, you're expecting to see this guy who's just going to be lightning quick, incredibly powerful, and a guy that nobody can get by. But I think there's some issues with the technique at times, because it seems like guys are slipping his blocks when he should be dominating his man, and it just doesn't always happen. So that consistency is the one thing that you worry about a little bit with Tristan Wirfs, but which is why I think he ultimately falls just a little bit, won't be taken number 4 overall, but I think that's a nice consolation prize, going 14 overall, and get to block for Tom Brady. I think that just makes a ton of sense to me, sitting there number 14 overall, getting an offensive lineman to really shore up that offensive line. Moving on to the second round, I think when you look at Ronald Jones the second, he went over 700 yards, a guy who has the ability, I think, to be a 1,000-yard rusher in the league and be more of a difference maker in the passing game. But even with Ronald Jones on the roster and carrying the load, when you look at the running back group, Dario Ogunbowale, TJ Logan, Aka Cedric Ware, those guys don't really strike it fear at all. If you're opposing defenses, I'm looking at J.K. Dobbins out of Ohio State, and this just makes a ton of sense. Dobbins, look, he was number 6 in the voting in 2019. A guy who went over 1,000 yards in each of his 3 seasons there at Ohio State. The only other guy to do that, Archie Griffin. Over 1,400 yards, sharing the backfield with Mike Weber as a freshman. This past season, went over 2,000 yards, 2,003 yards, 21 touchdowns, 6.7 yards per carry, had 23 receptions this past season as well. If you do all the math, that's 4,459 total yards on the ground, 38 touchdowns, and then 71 receptions, scores 5 touchdowns as well. And, a guy who, the lateral quickness is one of those things that really, I think that and the vision, his ability to see the cutback lanes, put his foot in the ground, get north and south. A lot of times he's making cuts down the field and not losing any momentum, not losing any speed. People worry about his home run hitting ability. Is he a guy that's really going to be a burner and being able to run away from people? We didn't get to see him run at the combine. Did put up 23 reps in the bench press. 5'9", 209. I think he has, he may not have the breakaway speed, but a guy that has enough, he's quicker than he is fast, but he has enough speed to really be a playmaker there out on the edge. Another guy who has exceptional hands, runs the angle route very well. If he's getting out on a wheel route, looks the ball into his hands before he gets up the field. To me, you put him in this group, and with Ronald Jones, I think he ends up becoming the feature back, and which is okay. I think these are 2 guys that can feed off of each other, but I think at the end of the day, J.K. Dobbins just makes a ton of sense. And You pair him up with Ronald Jones. I think if I'm Tom Brady, I get him in the second round. I'd be very ecstatic to get a weapon like that in my offense. So moving on to round number 3, I said that they needed to address the offensive line early and often. And I'm looking at another guy out of Ohio State, ironically enough, and that's Jonah Jackson, number 76 overall, 6'3", 306. This is a veteran guard. And look, he's somebody who was always seemed to be, he's not overly athletic, but he just got the job done. And there are other offensive linemen there for them who I think were, like Wyatt Davis, was a guy that really everyone's talking about. They're excited about him as a potential first round pick. But this guy, Jonah Jackson is a guy who I think can come in and challenge for a starting job right away. I think, that consistency that he brought to the field, and a guy who just always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. When you look at the offense, Ali Marpet sitting there at the left guard position, there's a chance he could even kick into that center position. Potentially, Ryan Jensen, I think there needs to be an upgrade there. Alex Kappa right now is looking at the right guard. Depending on what happens with Joe Haig and Tristan Wirfs, you could potentially see a move there. So Jonah Jackson is a guy that I think come in, play left guard, allow Ollie Marpet to move over to the center position. Now you've got Smith, Jackson, Marpet, Wirfs, and Haig. I think you've already addressed and upgraded that offensive line, quite a bit with just a couple of moves there in the draft. Day 3, Tom Brady's not going to be on that roster forever. We know this. And without Jameis Winston there, they brought in Blaine Gabbert. You've got Ryan Griffin, but I think you still need to bring in a young quarterback, a guy that could potentially learn from Brady and potentially be his heir apparent. And when you've got Bruce Arians as your head coach, you know that this is a guy that wants to push the football down the field. And I think the perfect match in this quarterback class is going to be Jacob Eason out of Washington. 6'6", 231 pounds, cannon for an arm, can make all the NFL throws. My biggest thing is can he dial it back? Everything has to be a fastball with him. You don't see much trajectory with his passes, which means it's a laser. And a lot of times he's going to end up overthrowing guys. He needs that touch, put more air under the ball. And I think there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve there. I think he's going to have to, Arians will be working with him to really develop more of that touch than anything else. But it just seems like a perfect fit for me with going with Jacob Eason there in round number 4. There's talk that Jacob Eason can come off the board in round 2, round 3. Someone was even talking about him possibly going into Tampa at number 14 overall. Let's not get carried away. At 117 overall, I think that's good value for Jacob Eason. That really is what makes sense. Let's not get crazy with everything. Let's not try to project him into the first round. I think 4th round actually feels right, with what he did in 2019. This is a guy who he started his career at Georgia, had a tremendous freshman year, gets hurt. Jake Fromm comes in, takes over his job, and he ends up transferring to Washington. Sits out a year, and really this was his first year of action. And, it was one of those things to where it was kind of a mixed bag. In Chris Peterson's last year there with the Huskies, I thought there were flashes of brilliance from Jacob Eason. And like I said, a lot of passes would sail. He wasn't always on target. There were times where he put the ball behind the receiver. Still threw for 60 completed 64.2% of his passes, over 3,100 yards, 23 touchdowns, just 8 interceptions. And the completion percentage is significantly better than when he was at Georgia, where he threw for just 55.2% of his passes. That was his completion percentage. So I look at Eason, and I think he's someone who can come in, learn from Arians, and potentially be the quarterback of the future there whenever Tom Brady decides it's time to hang it up. So Tampa Bay have 2 picks in round number 4, and I think they need to get another weapon for Tom Brady. And let's see. Tampa's pick, it's number 139 overall. I'm looking at John Hightower the 6'1", 189-pound receiver out of Boise State, playing on the blue turf there, Albertson Stadium in Boise, Idaho. And why Hightower? Well, Hightower has tremendous speed. He can stretch the defenses vertically. I'm looking at this team. You got Evans, you got Godwin, but after that, there's Justin Watson. I think Scott Miller is a guy who could play in the slot a little bit, but we needed that vertical threat, to take some pressure off of Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. And I think that John Hightower is able to do that. Ran a 4.43 40 at the combine, 38.5-inch vertical leap. More athleticism than I was really expecting to see out of Hightower. But this is a guy who, you can't really turn on the film for Boise State in 2019 and really expect to see a whole lot. You had Jalen Henderson and Hank Bachmeier there at the quarterback position, and there were some growing pains there with them. And so despite that, you still had Hightower, 51 catches, 943 yards, and 8 touchdowns. That's 18.5 yards per reception. So absolutely a guy who was making plays down the football field. Also had a kick return for a touchdown in 2019. So, tremendous athlete, vertical threat, gives that presence there for Tom Brady. I think that makes absolute sense to me there in round number 4. Now looking at round number 5. And Tampa, I wouldn't say it's an acquisition, but a big signing. They brought back Ndamukong Suh for another season. They got William Golston on the opposite side. Raheem Nunez-Roches is also brought back as well, but I still think they need another defensive end. Ndamukong Suh, it's almost like a year-to-year deal with him. Is he going to be signing and staying on the roster? Is he a guy who's going to end up transitioning and moving on? And with Suh, just a 1-year deal, 1-year, $8 million deal. Nunez-Roches signed a 1-year, $1.5 million contract. So both of those guys, their long-term future going to be in question. And so I'm looking at, who could be a guy that could fit in there in this 3-4 front. And how about a guy out of NC State? Larrell Murchison, a guy that people really aren't talking about, and a guy who I think could be a really good pro. 162 overall. He's 6'2", 297 pounds. If you watched him at the combine, you're going to look at the 40 time and go, ran a 5.05 40, did bench press 225 29 times, so there is some power behind this guy. But really, one of the things, if you watch the drills, this was a guy who had a really nice hip bend. And you saw some of the ankle flexion in some of the drills as well. And I look at him and I think he can get after the quarterback at the next level. Played just 2 seasons there for the Wolfpack, but 20 tackles for loss, 11 sacks, including 7 this past season. I think he's going to generate some pass rush coming off the edge. And I think it's going to be a nice fit. He'll be a rotational player and not expect him to do a ton right now. Really focus on some of his pass rush moves, especially these secondary moves, and work on some of his agility. And, you might be talking about a guy who can work his way into, a spot starter, within the first couple of years. I think he's got that type of, he's not going to be the best athlete in the world, but a guy who just gets the job done. And then looking at finding more pass rush ability, looking at an outside linebacker, I'm looking at James Smith-Williams. And, this is a guy who played defensive end while at NC State. And I'm looking at the outside linebacker position for Tampa. And you figure that JPP, who was brought back, he'll probably man an outside linebacker position along with Shaquille Barrett, who got the franchise tag. Shaquille Barrett with an incredible breakout season, 19.5 sacks. But there's really no depth behind these guys. There aren't any proven players. You've got Quentin Bell, Anthony Nelson, some guys that could potentially fill in there, but I think you need to continue to address that pass rush. And when you're looking at a guy like Smith-Williams, you're getting him in the 6th round, and I really think this is good value. A guy who's 6'4", 265, ran a 4.640, bench press 225, 28 times. We has some power, and he's one of those guys who I think has some scheme flexibility. A guy that doesn't have to necessarily, I'm sorry, scheme versatility. A guy who doesn't have to just play as a 43 defensive end. He can be an outside linebacker in a 34 defense. And, in his career, 12 tackles for loss, just 8 sacks. But a guy who really has battled some injuries. And that's really the biggest thing. Only played in 6 games this past season. I think 2018 was the one year that he was able to play almost a full season, played in 11 games there at NC State, had 9 tackles for loss and 6 sacks. So he has some pass rush ability. You just have to keep him on the field and keep him healthy. I think 6th round, I think that makes some sense. A guy, like I said, a tremendous athlete. If you can keep him healthy, I think this would be a really nice selection there for Tampa. Be able to address some of that pass rush, get some more depth to that position, be able to help out Shaq Barrett, JPP and company. So those are the draft picks there for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So moving just 2 picks in round number 1, we're going to go ahead and make the stop in Atlanta with the Atlanta Falcons sitting there at number 16 overall. And the Falcons, this is a team that's really making a lot of moves, and it's interesting to see just how many guys are not going to be there in Atlanta, whether it be through free agency or just guys that have been released and let go. But when you're talking about it, guys like Devontae Freeman and let's see who else, Devondre Campbell is gone. And my computer's locking up on me. If we can go ahead and get to the next screen. There we go. Austin Hooper, your tight end. He's in Cleveland. Corner, Desmond Trufant. He's in Detroit. Wes Schweitzer, your guard, is in Washington. Vic Beasley, edge rusher in Tennessee, is in Tennessee now. Adrian Claiborne, another edge rusher. He's in Cleveland. Ty Sambrailo, offensive tackle. He's now in Tennessee. So, you look at this list, Jack Crawford, defensive tackle. He's in Tennessee. And really what you're asking yourself is, well, what did Atlanta do? Who did they bring in? You did get Dante Fowler, who really, to this point is kind of underachieved, had his best career, had a double-digit sack season, and he's coming back to play for his college coach and Dan Quinn. So that was a nice pickup there for Atlanta. Todd Gurley is really taking the place of Devontae Freeman, signed a 1-year, $6 million deal. Is he a long-term answer? Really the big question is going to be what's going to happen with that knee. That's going to be the biggest concern. Also brought in Laquan Treadwell to man that receiver position, a guy who was hoping to resurrect his career, really never got going there in Minnesota. So Atlanta, you can see, lots of holes. Where do they really go? And I think what you have to really look at there is they lost Claiborne and they lost Beasley. So when you're talking about that, that's 12 of the team's 28 sacks. Now, 28 sacks, that basically, that was number what? Believe it was tied him for 29th or 30th overall in the league. When you lose your two sack artists, two top sack artists, you're almost half of your production. Beasley really, was kind of a bust after his sophomore campaign, had 15 and a half sacks in 2016. Never really could repeat that and opted for the change of scenery. Dan Quinn, Thomas Dimitroff still have to get production out of Tack McKinley. He was a former first-round pick as well. Finished 2019 with just 3.5 sacks. Has total just 16.5 in his first 3 seasons in Atlanta. His future beyond 2020 is in serious doubt. So yes, they have Dante Fowler, but they need to get somebody on the opposite end of him. And really look, Fowler is coming off the 11.5 sacks with the Rams. Clearly his best, as he just managed 16 sacks in his first 4 seasons combined. So adding an edge rusher who can consistently get home opposite Fowler, Kalavan Chason. Look, if he's there, and I think Atlanta may even trade up to get him. Chason played in just 12 games as a true freshman, started 3, but you could see some of that natural pass rush ability. Ended up with 4.5 tackles for loss and 2 sacks. Expected to be the next great edge rusher at LSU, but those expectations really had to be on hold in 2018 when he tore his ACL in the season opener. But he bounced back in a major way. First team All SEC honors in 2019, 13.5 tackles for loss, registered 6.5 sacks, while also recording 60 tackles in 13 starts. Very long edge rusher, very fluid turning the corner, shows excellent flexibility to dip his inside shoulder under the offensive tackle's pad level. Wins with his hands as well, slapping the offensive tackle's hands away, ripping through before flattening out to the quarterback. Spin moves are very compact and quick. Changes his directions in a hurry without any wasted movement. I watch him play, and he's 6'5", 250 pounds, and he reminds me a lot of Brian Burns. We talk about it, that ankle flexion, his ability to put his body as a result in some of these awkward angles to be able to bring down quarterbacks and really pursue the quarterback, get there in a hurry. The quickness in flipping those hips and turning from coming off the edge to flattening out and getting to the quarterback. So smooth, so quick. And what I really like too about Chason is that speed to power, his ability to long arm a guy. And when you look at Chason, he looks slender. He looks very slender in his build, and yet he generates a ton of power. And that's one of the things I think is really surprising. You see him; he'll extend that arm into the pad level or into the pads of the offensive tackle and drive him back and into the quarterback. And that's one of the things that I think is really deceiving with him, is that power. When he gets his hands on the offensive tackle first, that speed to power is really impressive. In the SEC championship, when LSU faced off with Georgia, he got to match up with Andrew Thomas and more than held his own. He won with his explosiveness. There was on one play where he started upfield, got Thomas leaning, spun back inside with his low center of gravity to take down Jake Fromm. On another play, used his speed coming off the edge to beat Thomas, who didn't even get his hands on Chason when he got to the quarterback. But when he let Andrew Thomas engage him and get his hands on him, he'd get easily driven back away from the pocket. That's one of the things that he has to really work on, is make sure that he wins with his hands, wins with that explosiveness, because if he doesn't have the ability to shed those blocks if an offensive tackle really gets his hands on him and locks him up. That said, I think Chason does have a nonstop motor, relentless in his pursuit of the football. In the college football title game against Clemson, he fell down on one play, got up, beat the left tackle, Jackson Carman, inside to hit Trevor Lawrence, forced a throw well before Lawrence wanted to deliver it. Speed to the perimeter to chase down running backs in the running game as well. High character player, good student, made the SEC honor roll, 3.10 GPA as a business major. When I look at Chason, though, it's hard not to see Barkevious Mingo, who was the 6th overall pick of the Browns in 2012. Similar measurables. Mingo, in his 3-year career with LSU, 29 tackles for loss, 15 sacks, including 15 tackles for loss and 8 sacks in his sophomore season. He was productive in his rookie year, 9 tackles for loss, 5 sacks, but he's just managed 5 sacks in his next 6 seasons, and has played for a total of 5 teams during that span as well. 7-year pro, and really hasn't had the career that you would expect from the 6th overall pick. And I'm not saying that Chason's going to have a similar career, but the comparisons are there. So you just hope that history doesn't repeat itself. And I think the explosiveness and what we've seen out of Chason, I think he's got a little bit more power than Mingo does. And, frankly, Atlanta's going to need him to really push Takk McKinley. And if he has a big season, I think that Atlanta can really transition and move on. If Chason does come off the board before Atlanta's there, and I've considered that, then the next question is, okay, well, where's Javon Kinlaw? I have him going to the Jags. If somehow Isaiah Simmons goes to Carolina and Derek Brown goes to the Jags at number 9, then there's a chance that Javon Kinlaw could be in play for Atlanta at number 16. If those two guys are both off the board, then you're really going to have to figure out what Atlanta's going to want to do. They may end up deciding to trade down. They may trade down and look for a pass rusher there. Potentially, Yetur Gross-Matos. I don't know that they'd reach for A.J. Epinesa here. He just doesn't fit the profile for a Dan Quinn, Thomas Dimitroff type of player. They're all about speed. They want to get guys who can come in there and play with a tremendous amount of speed, whether it is Vic Beasley or Devondre Campbell or Deion Jones, Takk McKinley, you name it. Those are the guys that really fit that profile. Clavin Chason is that guy as well. So I think if there's a chance to move up to get their guy, to get Chason, you might see Atlanta move up to make that happen. So Atlanta, in round number 2, I'm looking at Atlanta, and Alex Mack is their center. And Alex Mack, look, he's a Pro Bowl center and a guy who really is a consummate pro. 11 years in the league, 34 years of age though, and he's going to be a free agent at the end of the season. And I think, when you start getting these offensive linemen who are starting to get a little long in the tooth, you start worrying about, whether or not they're going to be able to stick around. We've seen some guys at the center position for various reasons retire unexpectedly. And I'm looking at Alex Mack. How many more years does he really have in him? And that's really a big concern. He signed a 5-year, $45 million contract. He's in his last season. Really want to see what he can do. But I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, we may be looking at his last season in Atlanta because of that. And if that's the case, if ultimately they decide they do want to move on, then I'm looking at a guy like Matt Hennessy, a guy who, from a pass protection standpoint, I believe he was graded out at 98% in 2018 by Pro Football Focus. Hennessy 6'4", 307 out of Temple, ran a 5.18 40 at the combine. A guy who I think could also kick inside to guard. So even with Alex Mack there at the center position, if he ends up signing and they keep him there for a couple of years, I'm looking at, you've got James Carpenter at left guard, Chris Lindstrom, the first-round pick from a season ago, is at right guard. Jake Matthews and Caleb McGarry at the tackle positions. I think you're really setting yourself up to have some, a nice core group of young offensive linemen. And really, Alex Mack right now is the veteran leader of that group. Although, Jake Matthews is really going to end up being that guy that's going to lead that group of youngsters up front. But I think Matt Hennessy just has that feel of a guy that can come in and really, from a pass protection standpoint, he's going to protect Matt Ryan back there. And the athleticism, his ability to climb to the second level, I think you're going to see that as well. That just makes a ton of sense for me. Like I said, whenever Alex Mack hangs it up, they'll have his replacement there on the roster. Now, looking at the 3rd round pick, I mentioned that Devondre Campbell no longer on the roster. You've got Dante Fowler, who could potentially be outside linebacker, kind of that similar position that Vic Beasley played. So you've got Deion Jones, middle linebacker. I'm looking at a linebacker by the name of Akeem Davis Gaither out of Appalachian State. Now, Akeem Davis Gaither, a guy who was really fun to watch. He's 6'1", 224 pounds, and just played all over the field for the Mountaineers. I think Davis Gaither, he not only can play the run, he can get after the quarterback a little bit, and he can drop into coverage. So he's one of those new age linebackers. I think he's got pretty good length at the linebacker position as well. In his last 2 seasons there with Appalachian State, over 200 tackles, 24 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, and 15 pass breakups. did have one interception there in 2019 as well. But, a guy who just can play sideline to sideline. And like I said, he can make plays behind the line of scrimmage. He can play in the box if you want him to. He can drop into coverage. And I'm looking at, they need to find a way to replace Devondre Campbell there at the linebacker position. And I think Akeem Davis-Gaither can absolutely do that. So Atlanta, moving on to day number 3. And, I'm looking at this and I'm looking at my mock draft and I'm looking at Atlanta. They've got Todd Gurley. Could they go running back? I think there's still a chance that they could go running back, but one of the things, they've got Brian Hill, they've got Kadri Allison, they've got Ito Smith. And frankly, these were guys that were able to step in and be productive for Atlanta for a time there on the ground. They don't strike fear into opposing defenses like Devontae Freeman did, or frankly, for that matter, Tevin Coleman. You've got Todd Gurley. Hopefully that knee, he can play well and be the bell cow, but depending on what happens with Gurley, he may not be on the roster in 2021. And I think, next year's draft, that might be where you really look to key in on a running back. And depending on where Atlanta falls, Travis Etienne is the first name that comes to mind. That might be a guy to target, potentially even trade up into the draft to secure his draft rights. But I'm looking at the cornerback position. Obviously, as I mentioned, you lose Desmond Trufant, who's really one of your core guys there in the secondary. You have Isaiah Oliver, who's really going to be your bell cow, if you will, your leader at the cornerback position. You got Jordan Miller, Bleedy Ray Wilson was brought in. You have Kendall Sheffield there as well. I'm going to look at a guy that can play in the slot. I think if you have Miller, you have Oliver. And then how about a guy like Amik Robertson out of Louisiana Tech? Now, Amik Robertson, didn't get to really perform at the combine at all. Just 5'8", 187 pounds. But, if you haven't seen him play, he's one of the better group of 5 players in this draft. And, I initially had him coming off the board in round number 3, and I moved him down just a little bit just because that lack of size can be concerning for teams, I think. But when you look at the production, 23 tackles for loss at the cornerback position, which is absolutely ridiculous. 7.5 tackles for loss at least in each of those 3 seasons there for the Bulldogs. He did come out a year early, so he's a junior underclassman coming out. 14 interceptions. So he had 5 interceptions in 2017 and 2019. And then 34 pass breakups, back-to-back double-digit pass breakups in 2018 and 2019, finishing with 16 as a junior. This is a guy who's also returned 3 interceptions for touchdown. Ball hawk. That's all you really need to say, ball hawk. And, I think because of his lack of size, he'll probably play in the slot. But he's somebody that you want to have on your roster. And I think he'd be a nice compliment there. And if Atlanta is able to land a guy like Amik Robertson there in round number 4, I think they have to jump at that opportunity. I think it makes way too much sense, especially when you lose a guy of Desmond Trufant's caliber. You shuffle some guys around. And now you need a slot receiver because Jordan Miller was really going to be your slot guy. Amik Miller, 119 overall, makes a ton of sense. Day 3, I should say, really going to be a little bit quiet for Atlanta unless Dimitroff and Quinn try to trade back into the draft. 158 overall in the 5th round, went to the Ravens. And then in the 6th round, they traded 191 overall to the Eagles, but they do have a pick in round number 7. And I'm looking at that tight end position. Again, there are a lot of holes that need to be filled here for Atlanta. And when you lose a guy like Austin Hooper, you need to find a replacement. They bring in Hayden Hurst. I think that's an absolutely, that's a great pickup. A guy who is an all-around tight end, a guy who didn't really get to showcase what he could do there in Baltimore, with the emergence of Mark Andrews. But you want to find another tight end there that you can really have on the roster. And that's one of the things that I think they're lacking. And I'm looking at Steven Sullivan out of LSU. It's kind of a bigger receiver type player there for LSU. Not much of a blocker, 6'5", 248 pounds, ran a 4.6, 640 at the combine, tremendous athlete. And I think that's one of the things that you're really doing, adding him to that roster for Matt Ryan, is getting another athlete. You've got Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, they're at the receiver position. And, Todd Gurley at running back, Hayden Hurst at tight end, get him another weapon really out there on the outside. And I think, Steven Sullivan can line up on the outside, be really a red zone guy that you can focus on. He can stretch defenses up the seam coming out of the slot. He can develop as an inline blocker and really, that's really the thing that I think he's going to have to focus on the most. But he's absolutely a guy who can be a difference maker in the passing game as a rookie. So we've got 3 teams down, we've got one more to go, and that's going to be New Orleans. And New Orleans, yet again, kind of the victim of the situation there in the playoff against Minnesota in overtime. Was it an offensive pass interference? Did Kyle Rudolph push off? I mean, it looked like he did generate that contact and did push off, but it wasn't called in the corner of the end zone, and Minnesota ended up upsetting the Saints. But the good news is Drew Brees is back. Taysom Hill was also brought back as well. They had a first-round tender on him. And as I mentioned earlier, when we opened the podcast, the Saints, what are they going to do? Are they going to go with another receiver? I think there's absolutely a chance that they could go with a receiver there. That whether it's Justin Jefferson or a T. Higgins, if they happen to be on the board. In my mock draft right now, they're not. But you could still go with Brandon Ayuk, Denzel Mims. There are going to be receivers available there at number 24 overall. But I think with Emmanuel Sanders being added to the roster, and you have Traquan Smith, I'm looking at that linebacker position, and I'm a little concerned, because they did lose A.J. Klein. Kiko Alonso did restructure his contract, and is going to be man in the middle there. I think really the only guy that I'm not too worried about in that linebacking core is DeMario Davis, the very productive weak side linebacker. But I think they need to get an infusion of some athleticism there to that linebacker position. Matai Te'o's gone as well. So I think the Saints at number 24, it's interesting. I think, like I said, they could still go receiver, but I think what the Saints can do is they can take advantage of the depth of this wide receiver class and find potentially a number 2 or number 3 option there at the wide receiver position. I think Patrick Queen out of LSU is a guy that would be interesting here. 6 foot, 229 pounds. And I don't know about you, but anytime I turned on LSU's game film, I saw number 8 making just flashing all over the field, making plays. He was only a 1-year starter, but I think his athleticism, his physicality, playmaking ability, reminiscent of the previous LSU linebackers, Devin White, Quan Alexander, Deion Jones, all of whom have had success at the next level. So I think he's the next guy to really fit that mold. Starting the season looking out of place at times, taking some poor angles to the football, but by the end of the season, super confident, always seemed to be in the right position to make a play. And look, his postseason performance in the SEC championship and the college football playoff were tremendous. Racked up 22 of his 84 tackles, 5 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks against Georgia, Oklahoma, and Clemson. And his last collegiate performance, he put an exclamation point on it, ending the game with Defensive Player of the Game honors in that win over Clemson in the title game. Speed was evident at the combine, ran a 4.5 40, was third fastest among linebackers. Which also means that athleticism to be the off-ball linebacker, on the field, quickly diagnoses plays, very decisive in his movements, reacting in an instant without any wasted movement to the football, tremendous lateral agility, to quickly move from gap to gap, scrape over the top. arrives to the football player under control, physical tackler, delivers good pop, wrapping up, driving through with his hips, athletic enough to cover tight ends and running backs, takes good angles to get into the passing lane, win in zone coverage. I think he can be an immediate starter, can plug him in wherever he's needed. And so you've restructured the deal there for Kiko Alonso. So he may not be may remain the middle linebacker. You can kick him outside, kick Queen outside, and then depending on what happens with Alonso, you can move him in there to that middle linebacker spot and be just fine. Alonso, going back to trustyspottrack.com, and Alonso, he did sign a 1 year, $3.15 million contract. He's going to be a free agent. Alex Anzalone, who's penciled in as a starter there at the outside linebacker position, he's in the last year of his rookie deal as well. So when you're looking at that linebacker position, I think this makes a lot of sense. Really get some of that youth infusion there in that linebacking position and give some athleticism as well. Saints don't have a ton of picks in this draft. They only have 5, but I think they're going to make them count. I'm looking at the tight end position in round number 3. Again, not going with a receiver, and you're going to ask, well, why not go with a receiver there? And there is a good chance in round number 3 that they do go receiver. Let's see who's still on the board. Just looking at my draft board, which again, you'll be able to pick up on the website, readyforthedraft.com. Antonio Gandy Golden, a big physical wide receiver would be on the board. Before they draft, who else do I have in round number 4? Isaiah Hodgins out of Oregon State would be on the board as well. Lynn Bowden out of Kentucky, provide some versatility. Colin Johnson potentially as well out of Texas. So there are some receivers that they'd be able to pick up there in round number 3, but I think getting the chance and the opportunity to get another tight end on the roster, to me, is something that I think they need to do for Drew Brees. They have Jared Cook, has been great, the last couple of seasons. Josh Hill, not really a guy that can be consistent as a pass catcher. I'm looking at a guy who was not only the John Mackey Award winner there for Lane Kiffin's Florida Atlantic Owls, but was also a 1,000-yard receiver at the tight end position, and that's Harrison Bryant. He's honestly my favorite tight end. He's my number 1 rated tight end, and here's the reason why. 6'5", 240 pounds, 65 receptions, over 1,000 yards, as I said, 15.4 yards per reception, 7 touchdowns. A guy who he's not overly fast, but he looks so smooth in his routes. He's a natural pass catcher, very confident with his hands, a guy who can stretch defenses vertically up the seam, but also his route running ability can create some separation as well. As I mentioned, ran a 4.73 40 at the combine, but a guy who I think can be a presence down the football field. And if you line him up in the slot, and line up Jared Cook, whether he's in line, on the line of scrimmage, or if he's split out as well, just gives you more versatility and more weapons and more options there for Drew Brees. So when do they go receiver? I think they end up going receiver in round number 4, and I'm looking at Van Jefferson out of Florida. Now, there's a good chance Van Jefferson come off the board earlier, and I think he'd be a 2nd to 3rd round pick in any other draft. But with the wide receiver class being as deep as it is, I think Jefferson falls a round or so down because of that. 6'1", 200 pounds, the son of an NFL wide receiver in Sean Jefferson, and really you can tell that he's a well-coached receiver, not going to be a burner, but a guy who just knows how to get open. And he was so fun to watch. Over 2,100 yards in his career, 16 touchdowns, transfer from Ole Miss, if you'll remember, played his last 2 seasons there for the Gators. But, he's a guy who, is sudden with his route running, a guy who does a really good job varying his release. You'll see quite a few different. The footwork is exceptional to set his man up, and just when you think he's running a slant, he's generating a different type of a release, and now he's going to go ahead and run a corner route instead. Then he's going to run a post on you. Really able to vary up, like I said, the releases. Really be able to vary up what he's doing there. Very reliable with his hands as well. Can make some plays after the catch. As I said, his dad, Sean Jefferson, did a tremendous job coaching his son, coaching him up, and a guy who I think can come in, be a starter opposite Michael Thomas. And I think that, with that duo, they could do a lot of damage there in the NFC South. Looking at another receiver, I was looking at the receiving core in round number 5. I think another receiver could be in store for New Orleans. And, they've got Traquan Smith, but, there's really not a whole lot behind him. So if you have Michael Thomas, you have Van Jefferson, you have Emmanuel Sanders, you have Traquan Smith, you need another receiver in there. And I'm looking for another possession type receiver, I think. I was thinking possibly a burner, but I'm looking at Tyler Johnson. And you're saying, well, why is Tyler Johnson falling all the way to the 5th round? And it was just one of those things for me. The separation is really what worries me. And you're going to say, well, why? I mean, over 200 receptions, 3,300 yards, back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons, 33 touchdowns, including back-to-back double-digit touchdowns seasons. A guy who he runs the slant to perfection. This is a guy who you'll see him run that slant over and over, just has a knack for getting a quick release off the line and sets his man up, with a quick jab step to the outside. And then he's squaring his body to the quarterback and making that catch, creating just a little bit of separation to get those slants. But can he separate down the field? I think the thing for me with Tyler Johnson is I think he could absolutely be a 3rd round pick, but I think he can also fall to the 5th round. And if he does that, I think he'd definitely be on New Orleans' radar. And if you can add him to the mix as well, I think he'd be worth doubling up for at that receiver position. And then in round number 6, I think you could potentially be seeing the Saints look at a corner. And the reason why is you look at him and you're like, well, the Saints have Janoris Jenkins and they have Marshawn Lattimore, Patrick Robinson kind of up and down. Eli Apple is gone. He's still a free agent. Things didn't work out with the Raiders, so he's still a free agent. But I think you need to add another corner there. Patrick Robinson, like I said, up and down play. You have solid starters, but you really need a guy who can be that 3rd corner. And I'm looking at a guy like A.J. Green out of Oklahoma State. Excellent length, 6'1", 202. The biggest concern there, ran a 4.62 40, but I thought his postseason performance in the All-Star games really showed that he can make plays on the outside, that he has some cover skills. Again, the long speed, some stiffness in his hips as well, but a guy who can showcase some cover ability. 21 pass breakups in his career, 6 interceptions. Really wasn't able to duplicate that 4 interception season there as a sophomore. Did have 11 pass breakups as a junior, and as a senior, teams really shied away from him. He only had 1 interception and 5 pass breakups, but that's because they didn't really want to pick on A.J. Green. They're looking at Rodarius Williams on the opposite side, and that's really who they wanted to focus on. So he didn't see as many passes coming his way, so the stats are a little bit deceiving in terms of his productivity, and it's really because teams did not want to throw his way. He was really known in the Big 12 as one of the better defensive backs in that conference. And so quarterbacks were really smart. They stayed away from him. And, if you watched Oklahoma State football, you know that, Rodarius Williams got picked on quite a bit. So that's really how I see the NFC South taking shape. And, I feel pretty good about my selections and my projections on where I see guys going and really, where the fits might be. And for me, I look at these players, and this is one of those things. It's really the culmination of a lot of hard work I've watched over 200, probably 250 games, pretty much from beginning to end, on mostly FBS games, although I have tried to tune in and watch as many FCS games as possible as well. And so by the time I'm done with the season, I have a pretty good feel for the players. Then it's a matter of really also studying the NFL, taking a look at the teams, taking a look at the rosters, and it's kind of hard to do a mock draft before free agency because, those projections really go out the window once you have free agency take shape. And as I talked about in my last podcast, I also have to make sure that I don't fall for a team that's really focusing on a position in free agency. That doesn't necessarily keep them from drafting a player high in that draft. And I mentioned it in the last podcast, but I'll say it again. Tampa Bay, who we just talked about, they really addressed that linebacker position in free agency last season. They brought in Shaq Barrett and they really, focused on that linebacking core. And, there was talk, what was going to happen with Levante David? Was he going to move inside? What was going on there? Is Devin White going to get drafted there? And I kind of shied away from that because of all the activity at that linebacker position. I should have stuck with my gut. If you go back and look at my very first mock draft that was done in January, I had Devin White going to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And so I think that's one of the things. I really have to trust my gut in terms of who's going to be the best fit, what really just feels right in these situations. I had Cleveland Furrow going number 4 overall a season ago. I scrapped that. And where does he end up going? Number 4 overall to Oakland. So it's something that I really need to pay attention to. And we're going to be talking about the AFC South in the next podcast. And I look at a guy like Jordan Love. There's talk about him being a first-round quarterback. And, given the current layout of the first round, I don't see Jordan Love going in the first round, based on the draft order and where everybody sits right now. But I'm looking at a team like Indianapolis. I could potentially see Indianapolis. They traded away their first round pick to San Francisco. They got their 3 technique. They got DeForest Buckner, and Chris Ballard at the combine said that, hey, the 3 technique is what drives everything defensively. They got their 3 technique. They need a quarterback. They've got Phillip Rivers. Phillip Rivers, not really sure how long he's going to be there in a Colts uniform. May just be for a year. You got Jacoby Brissett on the roster, but he wasn't really a guy that, that's a big reason why they brought in Phillip Rivers. He wasn't a guy that solidified his status as the starter and didn't really take control of that offense. So there's concern there. He's more of a backup, playing in that backup role, spot starter type of quarterback, not a guy who's going to be that featured starter at the quarterback position. You're going to need to find your future face of that franchise. And I'm looking at Jordan Love. It could be in round number 1, but I've got him going off the board to the Colts in round number 2. I want to make sure I get the team right. I may not have the right round, but I'm going to make sure that I get the team right. And I think that's ultimately what's going to happen with Jordan Love. I think Indy trades into round number 1. Chris Ballard is going to look for the right value. He and Frank Reich pull the trigger, end up taking Jordan Love. So that's one of the things that I really see with the draft. And what I try to do is, if I see the right fit with the right team, we're going to see trades. We're going to see teams trade up. We're going to see teams trade down. I thought that Kansas City was going to ultimately take Deshaun Watson. I got fooled and it ended up being Patrick Mahomes. But I had KC down in the 20s taking Deshaun Watson. And so at the end of the day, teams are going to trade up and try to land their quarterback of the future. I want to make sure that I'm at least getting that team right, when it's all said and done. So we'll be taking a look at the AFC South. In addition to the Colts, you'll have the Jacksonville Jaguars. What are they doing there? Is it going to be Derek Brown? Javon Kinlaw makes a lot of sense there as well. I think either way, Jacksonville probably going to look defense. They have 2 picks in round number 1. Is that other edge rusher? Is it going to be AJ Epinesa? They do need to find a way to replace Calais Campbell opposite Yannick Ngakoue, who got the franchise tag, and who knows how long he's going to be there in Jacksonville. Houston, they made the big trade, traded away DeAndre Hopkins, brought in a running back. They needed a running back. They brought in David Johnson. I'm looking at a guy like Brandon Ayuk. I think in round number 2 could be that guy to be that number 1 receiver in Houston. I think that absolutely makes sense for me, for them. And then Tennessee. Tennessee is going to need to find corner help. They're going to need to find an edge rusher. They're going to need to find an offensive tackle. And I think they're also going to need to find a way to replace Jarrell Casey there. I think moving to the 3 technique, you'll see, or from the 3 technique to the 5 technique will be Jeffrey Simmons. And I think you'll still need to find that 3 technique. And so I think those are some of the real key need areas for Tennessee. And I think you're going to see, the first 4 picks really address all of those needs there for Tennessee. And then in round number 7, they'll be able to address the offensive side of the football. So we'll get into all of that. I'll have it released here in the next couple of days. And I'll also work on getting that website updated, get my 7-round mock draft out there. Hope you've enjoyed the content. Hopefully this has been an escape and a release for you. I know it has been for me. Thank you for tuning in. Enjoy your weekends, everyone. Be safe, be healthy. Make sure you wash your hands, hand sanitizer, Lysol. Be mindful of the social distancing, shelter in place. Also, make sure that you're ordering from your local restaurants. We got to do everything we can to support them. And we'll go ahead and pick this up and do it all again here in the next couple of days. So for ReadyForTheDraft.com, this has been the Ready for the Draft podcast. I've been your host, Gregg Schutze. Take care, everyone, and I am out of here.